On a damp morning in April 1975, a 28-year-old musician named Pete Ham walked into a remarkably gloomy garage and hanged himself. Just outside those cold walls, his golden voice was echoing from countless American car radios, dominating the Billboard charts with a fiercely unbreakable grip. He was the shining embodiment of the ultimate rock and roll fantasy, living the American dream that millions of teenagers desperately craved. What none of those captivated listeners could have possibly known was the venomous suicide note resting quietly in his jacket pocket. Let us rewind the tape to the vibrant dawn of the 1970s when the American dream seemed incredibly tangible. Pete Ham was merely a working-class dreamer from a modest industrial town clutching a beautifully weathered Gibson acoustic guitar. He possessed a pure and unadulterated passion for crafting magnificent melodies that could effortlessly resonate across vast turbulent oceans. The towering music industry swiftly crowned his sensational band Badfinger as the undeniable second coming of the legendary Beatles. Their mesmerizing hit singles aggressively dominated the fiercely competitive Billboard charts for countless weeks without showing any mercy whatsoever. Massive sold-out tours across the vast United States transformed these humble boys into international phenomenons almost immediately overnight. Screaming crowds in magnificent American stadiums desperately reached out to touch the brilliant architects behind those immortal golden harmonies. They were relentlessly living a glorious fantasy, bathed in the glowing neon lights of bustling coastal American cities. Financial prosperity appeared completely guaranteed, as their record sales figures skyrocketed into the heavily coveted and lucrative multi-million territory. From the outside looking in, Pete had officially conquered the towering zenith of the ruthless and chaotic entertainment universe. But here is where the seemingly perfect fairy tale begins to expose its deeply hidden and truly terrifying fractures. The deafening applause echoing through those grand arenas completely masked the quiet and sinister scratching of a poisonous pen. That monumental success was just a fleeting ray of blinding light before the heavy iron doors slammed shut permanently. The American music industry of the early 70s was a jungle of predatory contracts and executives waiting to devour unsuspecting young talents. The boys in Badfinger were brilliant musicians but completely unarmed when it came to navigating the labyrinth of massive corporate entertainment. They desperately needed a shield against the relentless pressure of constant touring and the aggressive financial demands of massive American record labels. Enter Stan Polly, a 50-year-old financial manager operating out of a sleek, high-rise Manhattan office overlooking the bustling, cold city streets below. He did not look like the typical music hustle artist who wore flashy jewelry or spoke in cheap, fast-talking industry jargon every day. Polly wore impeccably tailored bespoke suits that immediately projected an aura of unshakable stability and old-money New York financial sophistication. To these exhausted musicians from across the Atlantic, this seasoned executive felt like the ultimate savior arriving just in time. He actively cultivated the comforting image of a fiercely protective father figure who would gladly handle all the messy and complex business details. He promised to build an impenetrable fortress of financial security around them, so they could focus purely on writing their beautiful, timeless songs. He spoke calmly about long-term investments, trust funds, and corporate restructuring, words that sounded like a foreign language to these young, exhausted guitarists. The band felt incredibly lucky to have this sophisticated white-collar guardian standing firmly between their fragile art and the vicious corporate wolves. Here is where it gets interesting, because the comforting illusion of safety is always the most effective weapon of a skilled predator. While Pete Ham was pouring his raw soul into a battered acoustic guitar, his new manager was carefully structuring a permanent, invisible cage. Polly knew exactly how to manipulate the profound naivety of artists who cared far more about creating beautiful melodies than they did about money. The manager did not view Badfinger as a group of generational talents needing nurturing, but rather as an incredibly lucrative and exploitable financial vehicle. He was the classic New York corporate assassin, destroying lives not with a physical weapon, but with perfectly formatted legal documents. Every warm handshake was a calculated maneuver designed to gain unquestioned control over their entire artistic and financial legacy. That paternal warmth was simply the anesthetic applied right before the ruthless extraction of everything these young men had built. They had unknowingly handed the keys to their future to a man quietly preparing to lock them out forever. In the autumn of 1973, the entertainment industry watched Badfinger sign a monumental $3 million recording contract with the prestigious Warner Brothers Records. To the outside world and the starry-eyed musicians themselves, this staggering piece of paper represented the ultimate realization of the American dream. They had finally escaped the shadow of their previous label to secure a fortune that promised absolute creative freedom and lifelong financial security. But the real secret is that this celebrated document was meticulously weaponized to strip the band of every single penny they would ever earn. Stan Polly negotiated the historic deal with the cunning precision of a Wall Street predator, preparing a corporate slaughter behind closed mahogany doors. When you peel back the dense layers of legal jargon and financial clauses, the terrifying reality of the American music machine completely exposes itself. The $3 million was never an outright payment given directly to the working-class artists who actually wrote and performed the hit songs. Instead, it functioned entirely as a recoupable advance that the band had to earn back through punishingly high album sales and relentless touring schedules. Every single dollar spent on studio time, promotional tours, luxury hotel accommodations, and marketing materials was legally categorized as a debt against the artists. This predatory structure is known in the ruthless corridors of New York entertainment law as cross-collateralization, a term guaranteeing perpetual financial servitude. If their first album failed to cover its artificially inflated production costs, that massive deficit automatically transferred over to bleed their subsequent creative projects. Furthermore, the contract stipulated that the staggering advance money would be deposited directly into a corporate escrow account entirely controlled by their management firm. Pete Ham and his bandmates blindly authorized Stan Polly to operate as their exclusive financial proxy, surrendering all signatory rights without a second thought. They were essentially signing over the legal ownership of their own artistic legacy to a corporate entity that viewed them purely as disposable assets. According to the labyrinthine clauses buried on page 40, Polly's management company was entitled to deduct exorbitant administrative fees before distributing remaining royalties. These devastating management fees were calculated based on the gross revenue of the contract rather than the actual net profit generated by the musicians. Did these trusting young men ever hire an independent legal counsel to review the catastrophic terms of this supposedly life-changing Warner Brothers agreement? They simply trusted the sophisticated father figure in the expensive tailored suit, who assured them that all the confusing paperwork was standard industry practice. By appending their hopeful signatures to that fateful contract, they unwittingly constructed the impenetrable financial prison that would eventually orchestrate their tragic destruction. They had traded their artistic independence for a catastrophic illusion of wealth, becoming indentured servants to a corporate machine that exclusively rewarded the executives. The brilliant minds at Warner Bros. Were legally protected by airtight liability clauses, ensuring the label remained completely insulated from any internal management theft. This masterpiece of corporate exploitation was legally binding, perfectly legitimate under American contract law, and designed to silently execute its victims over several years. It was the ultimate bait and switch of the entertainment industry, wrapping a financial death sentence inside the glittering packaging of a Hollywood lottery. This massive $3 million triumph was actually the exact moment their promising lives swung irreversibly toward a dark and profoundly inescapable financial abyss. High above the suffocating concrete canyons of Midtown Manhattan, Stan Polly sat comfortably inside a climate-controlled executive office. The ambient noise of New York City traffic was completely silenced behind thick panels of expensive acoustic glass. From this elevated sanctuary, the ruthless architect of Badfinger's financial ruin operated his perfectly legal extortion machine. He did not need a ski mask or a loaded revolver to execute this incredibly audacious heist. He merely needed a fountain pen, a rotary telephone, and a profound understanding of corporate negligence. While the band sweated profusely in cramped recording studios, Polly was drafting blueprints for a financial labyrinth. The formidable Warner Brothers entertainment empire had just authorized a massive injection of capital for their newly acquired British superstars. An initial advance of nearly $1 million was wired across the Atlantic to fund their upcoming studio sessions. In a rational industry, this enormous sum would have been deposited directly into an account controlled jointly by the actual musicians. Instead, the staggering influx of corporate cash landed squarely in an escrow account managed exclusively by Stan Polly and his associates. The legal framework of that catastrophic contract allowed the management team to intercept the funds before Pete Ham ever saw a single penny. It was an exceptionally efficient predatory system designed to separate the artists from their rightful compensation without raising any immediate red flags. Polly immediately instructed his army of corporate attorneys to construct a sophisticated network of seemingly legitimate financial entities. He established a primary holding corporation named Badfinger Enterprises Incorporated, sounding remarkably empowering to the naive musicians who signed the paperwork. However, the fine print dictated that Polly retained absolute dictatorial control over every single monetary transaction processed through this specific corporate vehicle. He then created a secondary layer of opaque management agencies and obscure consulting firms registered in secretive financial jurisdictions. This intricate corporate architecture was not built to protect the band's growing wealth, but rather to systematically dismantle and redirect it. The money was slowly fractured into dozens of smaller payments, creatively categorized as administrative expenses, consulting fees, and exorbitant management commissions. But here is where it gets incredibly interesting for anyone studying the dark arts of corporate embezzlement. Once the Warner Bros. Advance entered this tangled web of shell companies, the money began a dizzying series of internal transfers. Polly would authorize a payment from Badfinger Enterprises to a separate management entity that he also conveniently owned and operated. This secondary company would then disperse the funds to various phantom consultants, washing the initial capital until its original source became untraceable. By moving cash through multiple institutional layers, he created an impenetrable firewall of plausible deniability that frustrated even the most aggressive forensic accountants. The funds simply vanished into a digital ether, transforming from hard-earned royalties into untethered capital floating freely through the American banking system. Every time the musicians desperately inquired about their missing royalty checks, Polly offered masterful theatrical performances. He would gesture vaguely toward towering stacks of fabricated financial ledgers, blaming minor accounting errors or sudden international tax complications for the delay. In reality, large portions of the Warner Bros. Capital were quietly funding his own lavish lifestyle and propping up his other failing business ventures. He was treating the band's escrow account as a personal slush fund, drawing upon it whenever he required immediate liquidity. The sheer brilliance of this sociopathic financial strategy was its terrifying reliance on standard industry practices that nobody ever bothered to question. He weaponized the mundane bureaucracy of the music business to mask a relentless and systematic campaign of unmitigated corporate theft. As the harsh winter winds began howling through the bleak streets of New York, Polly continued shuffling paper and signing lucrative disbursement checks. He dined at exclusive Manhattan steakhouses, his tailored suits purchased directly with the stolen sweat of working-class British songwriters. The invisible corporate spiderweb he spun had successfully captured its prey, draining the financial lifeblood while leaving their physical bodies intact. Back in the United Kingdom, the devastating reality of this magnificent illusion was finally beginning to surface in the form of empty refrigerators. This masterclass in white-collar deception was merely the quiet prelude to a violent emotional collapse that would soon shatter everything. While millions of enthusiastic teenagers joyfully sang his chart-topping melodies on their car radios, Pete Ham was staring hopelessly at a completely empty bank account. The glorious American dream that Warner Brothers had promised on paper translated into a chilling physical reality, where he could not even afford basic groceries. The legendary band that routinely sold out massive arenas across the entire country was now practically begging for meager advances just to survive the freezing winter. He was frantically preparing to welcome his first child into this world, yet he lacked the fundamental resources to put food on his kitchen table. The brilliant young musician worked himself to absolute exhaustion, pouring every ounce of his fractured soul into writing more phenomenal hit records for the label. His weary hands constantly bled over his trusted guitar strings in the freezing studio, blindly hoping the next glorious melody would finally break the invisible chains. He truly believed that sheer hard work and undeniable musical talent would eventually rescue him from this suffocating cycle of invisible corporate enslavement. Here is where the reality of the situation gets incredibly devastating for the desperate expectant father. Every single time a shimmering gold record was proudly hung upon the corporate wall, another massive chunk of his rightful earnings was quietly siphoned away. It is nearly impossible to comprehend the profound psychological torture of hearing your own voice on television, while your pregnant partner softly cries from relentless hunger. He was desperately dying of extreme thirst, while standing directly in the middle of a massive, overflowing river of glittering gold and platinum. His relentless creative exhaustion yielded absolute zero, because the sophisticated financial machinery had fundamentally designed it that way from the very beginning. The suffocating reality of Pete Ham's situation peaked during the bleak early weeks of April in 1975. He was a famous rock star expecting his first child very soon, but sadly lacked the money to buy a simple crib. His bank accounts were frozen while millions of dollars generated by his music disappeared into a complex and shady financial maze. He stared at the telephone in his modest home like it was the only lifeline left in a rapidly sinking ship. Every day became a humiliating routine of calculating how many basic groceries he could afford before his empty pockets ran completely dry. The man who had written international chart-topping anthems was reduced to begging for his own rightfully earned pocket change. He picked up the heavy receiver and dialed the familiar international number, connecting directly to that luxurious Manhattan high-rise building. The transatlantic cable carried his desperate signal across the ocean into the sleek corporate fortress, where his massive fortune was locked away. He listened to the mechanical ringing on the other end with a heavy heart pounding violently inside his exhausted and frail chest. A cold and polite receptionist answered the call with the practiced indifference of someone trained to block unwanted and desperate voices. He asked to speak with Stan Polly to simply request an advance on his royalties for basic medical and hospital expenses. The secretary placed him on a long hold that stretched into an agonizing silence filled with the hollow international static. "Now listen carefully. because the silence on that telephone line was the exact moment the devastating truth finally shattered his remaining hope. The protective father figure who had promised to shield them from the vicious industry wolves was refusing to even pick up. Stan Polly was sitting comfortably in his expensive leather chair, just a few feet away from that ringing telephone in New York. The Financial Guardian had completely severed all communication now that the intricate web of shell companies had drained the band entirely dry. The secretary finally returned to the line, only to deliver the rehearsed lie that Mr. Polly was completely unavailable indefinitely. Pete slowly lowered the receiver as the terrifying reality of his absolute powerlessness washed over him like a freezing winter storm. The psychological torment of that unanswered phone call was vastly more painful than any physical injury he could have ever endured. He was trapped in a quiet house with an expecting partner, while his manager continued dining at the finest Manhattan restaurants. The beautiful melodies he had crafted from his pure soul had been weaponized against him by a ruthless master of corporate exploitation. There was absolutely no legal recourse available, because the very contracts he had signed blindly gave Polly total authority over everything. The brilliant musician finally understood that the man hired to protect the sheep was actually the alpha wolf orchestrating the entire slaughter. His mind began to fracture under the unbearable weight of knowing he could not provide for his unborn child, despite massive success. Every subsequent attempt to reach the New York office over the following days was met with exactly the same impenetrable silent wall. The corporate machinery had extracted every ounce of commercial value from his artistic brilliance, and was now efficiently discarding the broken shell. How does a man survive the realization that his life's work has been legally stolen by the person he trusted the most? The deafening silence from Manhattan echoed through his quiet home and slowly transformed his remaining hope into a deep and toxic despair. He realized that the American legal system would fiercely protect the wealthy executive sitting in New York over a foreign working-class artist. The telephone became a dark monument to his monumental failure and a constant reminder of the invisible chains choking his entire existence. The crushing isolation drove him into a dark psychological corner where no amount of musical genius could possibly offer any meaningful salvation. He watched his pregnant girlfriend moving around their modest home and felt an overwhelming sense of shame that completely consumed his spirit. The millions of dollars his hit songs were generating at that very second on American radio stations were totally inaccessible to his family. He had been completely erased from his own financial destiny by a calculated stroke of a pen in a distant corporate boardroom. The bright light of his creative soul was finally extinguished by the cold and mechanical cruelty of the American entertainment business machine. He turned away from the silent telephone and began walking slowly toward the dark garage where his tragic destiny was quietly waiting. On that cold morning in April 1975, Pete Ham walked into his dimly lit garage with a heavy piece of rope. He left behind a pregnant girlfriend and a devastating handwritten note resting quietly on the dusty wooden workbench. The frantically scribbled message did not apologize for his drastic actions or express any typical final earthly regrets. Instead, it contained a blistering indictment of the ruthless manager who had systematically destroyed his entire professional life. Stan Polly is a soulless bastard, the desperate young musician had written in jagged, furious and tear-stained letters. I will take him with me, the note concluded, serving as a permanent curse against the New York executive. The American entertainment machine had finally consumed its brightest working-class dreamer, leaving absolutely nothing but a tragically broken corpse. You might reasonably assume that this horrifying public tragedy would instantly break the financial spell surrounding the surviving band members. Would the powerful music industry finally intervene and release the remaining musicians from their predatory contractual obligations? What happened next will completely shatter any remaining faith you have in the corporate American justice system. The Warner Brothers legal department simply froze all of their outstanding royalties and locked their entire catalogue in a perpetual vault. Tom Evans, the brilliant artist who had co-written their biggest international hits, was left to navigate the exact same financial nightmare. He spent the next 8 brutal years desperately fighting through a labyrinth of American courts to reclaim his stolen legacy. While his iconic pop songs generated millions in publishing revenue worldwide, Evans could barely afford to pay his basic heating bills. By the freezing winter of 1983, the exhausting international legal battles had completely drained whatever fighting spirit Evans had left inside. He was permanently trapped in a grueling deposition cycle, endlessly debating the ownership of his own creative output with faceless attorneys. On a dreary evening in November, he engaged in a violently bitter telephone argument regarding the unpaid royalties from his past. The crushing realization finally hit him that the invisible chains originally forged by Stan Polly would never actually be broken. He walked out into his unquiet garden, found a sturdy branch near the willow trees, and replicated Pete's tragic exit. Another beautifully gifted songwriter hung himself by the neck because the towering legal system valued corporate contracts over basic human survival. The absolute despair of knowing your intellectual property is making strangers incredibly wealthy, while you slowly starve, is profoundly lethal. Two incredibly talented artists were physically eradicated by the exact same piece of paper they had enthusiastically signed a decade earlier. The ultimate tragic punchline of this entire catastrophe is that the management company continued collecting administrative fees even after they died. Stan Polly never spent a single day in a prison cell for orchestrating this dual psychological and financial execution of innocence. He simply relocated his shady operations, bought a luxurious new residence, and continued exploiting the vulnerable dreamers of the music industry. The devastating corporate curse was finally complete, transforming a beautiful musical brotherhood into a dark cautionary tale of extreme capitalist greed. They were promised a shimmering American dream, but they were deliberately handed a perfectly legal death sentence printed on expensive stationery. While these two devastated men were being lowered into their respective graves, their greatest musical compositions continued dominating the global airwaves. Millions of unaware American teenagers were gleefully singing along to those catchy melodies while driving down sunlit coastal highways in California. The devastating contrast between their blinding public success and their agonizing private destruction represents the absolute pinnacle of corporate entertainment cruelty. They had successfully created timeless art that would outlive them, but the unforgiving capitalist machinery ensured they would never survive it. When the inevitable massive lawsuits finally reached the highly sterile courtrooms of America, desperate families fervently hoped for some poetic justice against the corporate machine. However, the formidable United States judicial system operates entirely on cold, unfeeling parchment rather than the agonizing tears of ruined artistic visionaries. A seasoned judge sitting high on a mahogany bench does not listen to beautiful melodies or care about who wrote the greatest hit. They meticulously analyze the microscopic print on those legally binding documents to determine exactly where the financial responsibilities truly begin and end. In this incredibly ruthless arena of corporate litigation, moral rightness means absolutely nothing if your ink is already drying on the wrong page. The devastatingly impartial nature of American jurisprudence ensures that a brilliant masterpiece holds the exact same legal weight as a worthless blank page. What happened next will surprise you, especially if you still believe that the mighty judicial system always vigorously defends the innocent and helpless. Everyone desperately wanted to legally brand Stan Polly as a monstrous thief who viciously stole the hard-earned wealth of innocent young musicians. But according to the incredibly strict interpretations of corporate contract law, that smooth-talking manager simply executed the exact financial terms that were voluntarily agreed upon. The devastating reality is that the ultimate enemy was not necessarily the greedy music industry or a single manipulative villain in a suit. The most dangerous weapon in this entire tragedy was the staggering ignorance of eager artists who casually signed away their entire existence. Nobody forced a gun to their heads in that luxurious Manhattan office when they traded their fundamental rights for a fleeting golden illusion. Those heavy legal binders stacked proudly on that massive wooden desk were carefully designed by expensive corporate attorneys to be completely bulletproof. Every single confusing clause and complicated financial provision was a meticulously calculated trap, waiting to snap shut around their unsuspecting creative victims. The Supreme Court eventually ruled that by willingly placing his naive signature on that dotted line, the artist had legally authorized his own financial execution. You simply cannot prosecute a man for aggressively taking everything when you have already given him the legal permission to do exactly that. The devastating power of a binding legal agreement will effortlessly crush the most extraordinary musical talent without showing a single shred of remorse. This brings us completely full circle back to that celebrated $3 million Warner Brothers contract that supposedly guaranteed their eternal legendary status. Pete Ham genuinely believed he was finally securing a beautiful future for his young family when he excitedly picked up that corporate pen. He never realized he was actually signing the exact document that would eventually force him to walk into that dark, suffocating garage alone. They spent years relentlessly searching for a ruthless criminal who violently destroyed the band, but the lethal weapon was just a simple signature. He traded his absolute brilliant soul for a meaningless piece of white paper, and the paper predictably demanded its ultimate terrifyingly fatal price. In the end, the American justice system did not fail Pete Ham. It just violently enforced the devastating promises he had blindly made. Exactly 50 years have passed since that unimaginably dark morning inside the quiet suburban garage. Yet the brilliant melodies Pete Ham created continue to echo across classic American radio stations every single day. His timeless songs have miraculously survived the immense corporate greed that tragically ended his young and promising life. Generations of fans still find immense comfort in those beautiful harmonies without ever knowing the devastating price he paid. The towering Manhattan office buildings could steal his money, but they could never truly confiscate his pure artistic soul. He left behind a profound musical legacy that far outlives the ruthless executives who once controlled his bank accounts. Those classic rock anthems have become permanently woven into the cultural fabric of the vast American entertainment landscape. You can still hear his voice soaring high through the speakers of cars cruising down sunny California coastal highways. The ultimate irony is that his pure artistic genius ultimately defeated the financial predators in the long historical run. They managed to temporarily steal his worldly possessions, but they failed miserably to erase his name from musical history. Every day, thousands of young artists arrive in massive American cities chasing that exact same glittering entertainment dream. They carry their battered acoustic guitars into trendy coffee shops, hoping to finally catch the attention of a major industry player. These incredibly talented kids desperately want to believe that pure artistic merit will magically protect them from corporate exploitation. They spend countless hours perfecting their vocal performances while completely ignoring the terrifying business realities of the music industry. Now listen carefully, because the industry has simply traded those old tailored suits for modern casual tech bro aesthetics. The fundamental mechanism of the entertainment machine remains precisely as dangerous today as it was in 1975. Your undeniable artistic talent will only make you an incredibly attractive target for the modern wolves waiting in corporate boardrooms. Those friendly modern executives sitting in Los Angeles cafes are still hunting for the exact same kind of naive brilliance. They will gladly offer you the world while quietly slipping a digital contract designed to harvest your entire creative future. The most crucial survival lesson you must understand is that raw passion is completely meaningless without solid legal comprehension. You can write the greatest generational anthem, but a single hidden clause will quietly transfer ownership to a complete stranger. The American legal system does not care about your artistic vision or how many late nights you spent intensely practicing. Corporate judges will always rule based purely on the black ink physically printed on the pages you willingly signed away. Protecting your creative dream requires learning to read those terrifying legal documents with the exact same dedication you give your instrument. Do not ever let a friendly smile convince you to skip hiring an independent lawyer to review your life-changing paperwork. The modern recording contracts are deliberately designed to be confusing labyrinths, meant to exhaust and confuse young independent creators. You must actively defend your intellectual property, because nobody else in this massive industry is going to do it for you. I think there is something incredibly powerful about focusing on the pure intentions Pete possessed before the industry crushed him. He was simply a working-class dreamer who genuinely believed that creating beautiful music was completely enough to build a life. The tragic end of his story serves as a permanent lighthouse, warning new generations away from those treacherous hidden corporate rocks. Whenever you hear those legendary Badfinger tracks playing on the radio, you should remember the beautiful spirit behind the tragedy. We must aggressively honor his memory by ensuring no other brilliant artist ever has to make that lonely walk to the garage. His immense sacrifice demands that modern creators finally wake up and take absolute control of their own financial destinies forever. I have been your dedicated host, guiding you through the darkest and most fascinating hidden corners of modern music history today. If you found this tragic documentary story compelling, please remember to physically smash that subscribe button right now. Leaving a thoughtful comment down below really helps push these important historical warnings out to the wider YouTube algorithm. Hitting that notification bell ensures you will never miss another deep dive into the fascinating mysteries of the American entertainment world. Thank you so much for taking this heavy journey with me, and I will definitely see you again in the very next video.